What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. Hope everyone had a very Merry Christmas. I spent the majority of the holiday in an absolute fever dream. I had a horrible case of the flu. I'm still not 100% over it, but I'm now back in my man cave in New York, and I am ready and eager to start ranting and raving about some film and television again. And what I'm going to be talking about today, I had no idea it even existed until yesterday, and I'm talking about Black Mirror Bandersnatch. And not to worry, I won't be getting into any spoilers until I give you fair warning. For my money, Black Mirror is the science fiction show of the 21st century when it comes to exploring our relationship with technology. When people talk about the great science fiction shows of all time, obviously they're going to talk about things like The Twilight Zone and the original series of Star Trek. But I think Black Mirror absolutely deserves to be mentioned in the same breath with that elite class of show. Not every episode is created equal, not every season is created equal, but Charlie Brooker and his team of writers, I feel like, have explored so many fascinating scenarios, and they keep finding new ways to up their game and explore new material. I thought the USS Callister episode from Season 4 was by far one of the coolest things that came out all of last year. So when I saw that a trailer had dropped yesterday for a new Black Mirror standalone movie, my curiosity was instantly piqued. I'm sure a lot of people were disappointed not to get some information on when we can expect Season 5, but I feel like as a placeholder to tide us over, I have a feeling Black Mirror Bandersnatch is going to be exciting a lot of debate for a very long time. Because if you haven't heard yet, Black Mirror Bandersnatch is quite different from your typical Black Mirror experience in that it is a completely, totally immersive experience, much like Steven Soderbergh's experimentation with his interactive TV series, Mosaic. But just as a way of giving you a little background information for this standalone story, David Slade is the director. He was the director responsible for Metalhead in Season 4. But apparently the term Bandersnatch is a very old one. As much as I'm embarrassed to admit it, I've never read a word of Lewis Carroll, but it's a word that comes up quite a bit in his poems and stories. Apparently in the sequel to Alice in Wonderland, the book Through the Looking Glass, this term was first seen in the poem Jabberwocky. And apparently it came up again in his 1870 form, The Hunting of the Snark. And then if you flash forward about 100 years, the term comes up quite a bit in Final Fantasy games. I have played many a Final Fantasy game, but I've never taken notice of the word. But I'm definitely going to start taking notice of it now because Bandersnatch is quite unlike anything I've ever seen. And that is not to say it's the best movie or the best TV show I've ever seen, but I like how it takes the gimmick of a choose-your-own-adventure format and then finds a variety of ways to twist it and subvert it so that it gives you an unpredictable experience, quite unlike what you're expecting going into it. And what I really admired about Bandersnatch is that it is a story that takes place in 1984, but what it doesn't do, it doesn't wallow in 80s nostalgia. It uses brilliant 80s music, and it uses a lot of brilliant ingredients of 80s pop culture, like choose-your-own-adventure novels and early 80s computer games. But for my money, I'm completely, totally over the 80s nostalgia craze. I feel like at this point there have been way too many movies and shows that have completely, totally exhausted whatever nostalgia I might have had for the early 80s. And I was around in the early 80s. I used to play Wizardry on the Apple II. I owned a ColecoVision. And I definitely read my fair share of choose-your-own-adventure novels. The Mystery of Chimney Rock is probably the one that I read the most times. But when I ran out of choose-your-own-adventure novels, my brother and I started reading this secondary series called Which Way, which is basically the same format, just a different brand. So when it comes to an RPG experience, I feel like one of the best ways to judge it is to what degree do you actually have control over the story. A lot of RPGs and video games will give you the illusion of decisions, but basically there's a central storyline, and no matter what you say or do, the outcome's pretty much the same, and I can't stand that. For me, an RPG is about choice, it's about building your own character, and when you make a decision, it should have real lasting consequences. And I feel like on that front, Black Mirror Bandersnatch was a roaring success. Plus, the environment which the story unfolds is just so insanely cool. Back in the early 80s, game designers were a lot like lone woodsmen. You could basically have one person design an entire gaming experience. And in the context of this story, there's a young designer named Stefan. He's a little shy, he's a little withdrawn, but his biggest ambition is to adapt this giant novel called Bandersnatch by Jerome Davies. And it's this huge epic fantasy tome that also gives you choices throughout. And the book was way ahead of its time, and it deals with parallel dimensions. And it deals with butterfly effects in terms of what decisions you make in which timelines and how it affects the other timelines. And the story basically begins when Stefan gets the opportunity or the green light to develop this into a game with a pretty tight deadline. And the rest of the story is basically what happens to you as you're trying to get the game finished. So that's about all I could say without getting into heavy spoilers. So I'll briefly close with this. You could criticize Bandersnatch as being gimmicky. And to a certain degree it is. I don't even know if I should call it a movie or a show or a game, because it's definitely an innovative experience exploring new terrain. But I applaud Black Mirror for trying to break the fourth wall in new and creative ways. I applaud Black Mirror for trying to create an immersive experience unlike anything seen on Netflix to date. And given how crazy and disturbing and surreal Black Mirror has been in the past, I have to admit I went into this experience with a little bit of caution and trepidation, because I knew by surrendering myself over to the experience, I was allowing the writers of Black Mirror to get inside my head a little bit. But I had an absolute blast with the experience, and I thoroughly enjoyed how it gave me the opportunity to go back and change some of my decisions so that I could explore more of the stories and their possibilities. In any event, with all my spoiler warnings out of the way, I have to say the most interesting part of Bandersnatch was how I almost felt like I was having an out-of-body experience at times. And because I'm a massive gaming fanatic, from the word go, all my decisions were geared toward trying to make the best game possible, make a successful game. But along the way, there are a lot of stumbling blocks. First and foremost, the main character is going insane, mostly because the main character is aware of the fact that somebody is controlling his actions and he starts pushing back. It's a little bit like that moment in the Neverending Story when the kid reading the book realizes that by screaming out loud, the characters in the story can hear him. And then he's actually affecting and dictating some of the actions in the novel itself. Because over the course of the story, Stefan starts to recognize that somebody's influencing the events and he starts to push back and resist. So what decisions you make in the movie don't necessarily happen because sometimes he decides to go the opposite direction. Perfect example, at one point, he's nervous and you get to choose whether or not he's going to rub his earlobe or chew on his fingernails. I chose chew fingernails, and you see him like fighting with his hand and resisting and slamming his hand down on the table. So Bandersnatch absolutely subverted my expectations at every twist and turn. But I like how the story kind of slowly eases you into the experience by giving you control over some minor choices like what kind of cereal do you want to eat or what kind of music do you want to listen to. But as the story options start to have greater and greater stakes, I started doing a little internal experiment because I wanted to see to what degree I actually did have control over the experience. Because I noticed that the movie kept trying to push me toward having this conversation with my therapist where I would explore memories about my mother. And at every available opportunity, I turned down that option because I wanted to see if the story would eventually force me to have that experience whether I like it or not. And I was relieved to see that I was able to avoid that element of the story entirely. Because much like when I'm playing an RPG game, I kind of had an idea of what kind of character I wanted to be as the story started to unfold, and I wanted to be a bit of like a mad genius. So any option that I had toward being more creative, more weird, more psycho, I always decided to go that way. And it did not disappoint, especially when it came to my interactions with the character Colin Rittman, played by Will Poulter. He absolutely steals the show as this celebrity designer that Stefan really looks up to. He's in complete control over his life. He's got a lot of successful games under his belt. He drives an expensive sports car. But unlike Stefan, who's kind of crumbling and going insane by degrees, Colin seems to have total control over his life, and in many ways, he is what Stefan is striving to become. But he knows the best music to listen to in your programming. He knows how to avoid the pitfalls of getting stuck down in the hole where you basically can't get out of your own way. He knows which drugs are the best for opening up doors and opening himself up creatively. And he also presents Stefan with a lot of the ideas that almost makes this story feel like a snake eating its own tail at times, because Colin is obsessed with different timelines. Colin's obsessed with the idea of whether or not we actually have the opportunity to do over certain decisions in our life. He's also acutely aware of the fact that there might be people manipulating events and that we might not have as much control over our own life as we think. And it leads to one of the best drug scenes I've ever seen in film or television, where they take LSD and they're talking about Pac-Man and parallel dimensions. And I must confess, due to this one great hallucinatory drug experience they have together, I ended up going online and buying a ton of Tangerine Dream music. But another interesting detail that I noticed while playing the game is that when you pause the movie, it doesn't show you a runtime. Depending upon what decisions you make, it could be a very short story or a very long story. And depending upon whether or not you start tripping balls and jumping off a building and committing suicide, or whether you decide to murder your father, every decision you make has major consequences, whether or not you decide to chop a body up or hide it in the backyard. And eventually I did achieve my goal of releasing a successful game, but it took me many tries. I think I released the game as a flop twice before I finally released a successful game that was considered a masterpiece. And during the closing credits, it does this interesting thing where you can go back to the main menu, or you can go back to key points in the story and make different decisions. So I ended up going down a different path where I ended up in jail, where I'm still obsessed with creating these choose-your-own-adventure scenarios. I was blown away by just the array of different options. And also how when you're making these decisions throughout the story, it never seems to break the storytelling experience. And that's hard to do when it comes to the editing and the sound mixing. When you're presented with a yes, no, or kind of binary situation, it's not like the game just freezes and pauses while you make your decision. It finds a way to stretch out and sustain those emotional beats while you make up your mind. So overall, I have to say I was really impressed by the experience. I doubt I'm going to go back and play it again because over the course of my first experience, I did manage to explore so many alternate timelines. I feel like I've kind of gotten more or less a complete picture of the options at my fingertips. fingertips, but I'm blown away by the fact that the people at Black Mirror are continuing to innovate and break new ground and give us new experiences. It would be so easy at this point for them just to rest on their laurels, to go on cruise control, to start repeating themselves, and to basically let the quality of the show slowly fizzle out over time. And the fact that they continue to challenge themselves creatively like this, I hope will continue to be a source of inspiration for anyone out there working in the genre of science fiction. In any event, I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap this video up. I strongly recommend that people at least give Bandersnatch a try. I can safely say you've experienced nothing like it on Netflix all year. But what it's really given me is an itch to play some video games. I'm going to spend the rest of the day gaming my face off. But I hope you enjoyed my reaction and review. Please consider subscribing to my channel. In the near future, I'll be back to review episode 1 of season 2 of The Orville, which I'm really excited to see. But if you want to talk to me about science fiction or role-playing games, or choose your own adventure novels, or fantasy novels, or whatever the case might be, by far the best place to reach me is on Twitter at Colbrax. There's a link in the show notes below, but you can pretty much find me there on Twitter anytime, day or night. But I just can't thank you enough for watching this video. Hope everyone has an amazing New Year's, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.